While we've been discussing case studies and pros and cons of specific nudges during the last discussions, we will now return to the more general question of what part nudges can, should, or must not play in regulatory democracies, and this despite all warnings and objections that have already been raised against abstractions. Are nudges and how are nudges compatible with fundamental rights? From a legal point of view, is it sensible to discuss nudging in abstract terms, or do we need to specify the area of regulation or develop a typology of nudges? As we heard earlier this day, German courts refused to answer these questions, so maybe we can find answers today. At least our panelists in their statements will address these and other issues before we then enter into the discussion. Alberto Alemanno is going to start with his presentation. He is Jean Monnet Professor of EU Law and Risk Regulation at HEC Paris and Global Clinical Professor at NYU School of Law. In his research, he focuses on the role of evidence in policymaking and adjudication. He has published extensively on EU regulation of the so-called lifestyle risk, that is, especially tobacco, alcohol consumption, and unhealthy diet. And in his work already has repeatedly addressed the question of what role nudges can play in the context of lifestyle risk. And today he's also going to elaborate on this question and especially explore the EU's possibilities to nudge. And he will thereby add the perspective of a legal scholar. Add the perspective of a legal scholar to what we've heard from the practitioners this morning. So the floor is yours. Please eat your statement.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. I would like to provide you a perspective on nudging in the European Union. This issue has already been touched upon in the morning, but I would like to address specifically the question whether the European Union can be and perhaps should be acting as a choice architect. If nudging raises some concerns, some questions, when it is performed by a nation state or a city or a municipality, be they about legitimacy, legality, or effectiveness, it appears intuitively more difficult when it is a supranational entity like the European Union doing the nudging. So this is sort of my premise. So what are the challenges and opportunities the behavioral insights may offer to the European Union? What the European Union could learn from behavioral insights? Are nudge-type interventions compatible with the European legal order? And is there anything specific about European Union law that makes the nudge debate different on this side of the Atlantic? I had the opportunity to work and to address some of those questions with a co-author, Annelise Sibony, together with a few contributors, and we have been trying to put together a few perspectives in a volume entitled Nudge and the Law, a European Perspective. So what did we learn? Let me share with you a few insights, a few ideas that we developed as a result of raising those questions. It quickly appeared evident to us that despite its universalistic appeal, the nudge discourse is and must be context-dependent. So we have to somehow contextualize it in the legal order in which we find ourselves. The language, the rationale, but many other features of the nudge discourse are not immediately transposable to Europe, notably to the European Union as it is. Europe does not only offer a very specific institutional context, posing its own challenges for testing, implementing, and embedding behavioral informed policy, but it's also a unique composite polity in which words do not always carry the same meaning or connotation as in the United States. So let me give you a couple of examples which are very trivial. In Europe, law and economics never became mainstream. It has never been driving policy making, and therefore discussing about behavioral law and economics does not always make a lot of sense. We don't necessarily have to respond to that tradition when approaching this issue. More critically, we don't necessarily need to define a situation as a behavioral market failure in order to justify governmental action in order to target behavior. We don't really owe much to that tradition. So once we have demonstrated that the US-dominated discourse on nudging is not always transposable to the EU, we try to come up with our own little language, our own taxonomies, in order to reframe the debate and to realign it or to adapt it to the political and legal realities of the European Union. So we all know that the nudge debate has been, or at least originates, as a sort of Anglo-Saxon affair between US scholars and British policymakers who have been plotting for a new course of action in policymaking across the world. In Europe, and in particular the European Union, both in terms of academic circles and in terms of policymakers, has been largely on the side of this storyline. At the same time, both the European Union and the member states seem to be increasingly looking at the possibility could imply this for the Union. So, as you have heard in the example, several examples this morning, the EU has not been nudge-free entirely. There have been a few attempts at integrating behavioral insights in certain policy areas. However, we cannot say there has been a systematic commitment towards behavioral-informed policymaking. However, things are changing a little bit, partly inspired by the US executive order, which encourages federal agencies to take into account default options, disclosure requirements, in which policies are developed at the European level. And there, in the draft document, you could find a clear reference to behavior and behavioral sciences and research, both when the policymakers define the problem definition, what do we have to regulate in the European Union, but also at the level of the indication of the different and choice of the different policy options. So things are changing a little bit from, let's say, a legal framework perspective from the EU. And some countries, including Germany, are somehow following that way. So they are trying to incorporate this evidence-based reflex when looking at policy making. And this fascination by the European Union and by some other European governments is not entirely surprising. By now, we all got a sense that nudge-type interventions appear very appealing. They seem very appealing to government. And this is because they might give rise to effective, low-cost and choice-preserving policies. So nudges seem to seduce both the European Union and the member states on two fronts. Nudge as politics and nudge as a methodology, as an applied social science. So let's start from the first one. Why nudge of politics could make sense in the European Union? Well, we all know that the European integration process is facing more and more mistrust from its own citizens. There are citizens in some European countries that are even calling for repatriation of powers. And the new commission, led by Juncker, it clearly promised to somehow redefine, in the framework of his own better regulation initiative, the relationship existing between the member states and the European Union. And it seems that it is exactly against this backdrop that nudging may provide a way forward. In particular, by injecting a new understanding of where a given policy problem lies, behavior, and why this might prompt regulatory action, nudge-type intervention may, due to their soft and minimalist form of intervention, appear quite interesting when reinterpreting or looking again at the reallocation of competences between the European Union and the member states, probably to the advantage of the member states, to those entities which are closer to the polities. Let's have a look at nudge now as an applied science. There's more to nudge than its political appeal to European policymakers. Nudge in general seems to carry the potential to inject a culture of evidence, of testing, of experimentation, which is not really typical of European policymaking, at least not yet. Rather than relying on anecdotal evidence, rather than relying on ideologies, rather than relying on emotions, behavioral informed regulation as such and the nudge movement could somehow stimulate the European policymaker to become more evidence-based than when simply preparing conventional regulation. In Europe, probably more than in the US, there is a need to inculcate a culture leading policymakers to ask themselves, will this policy work? May it work? And this is not a question that is always in the back mind of policymakers. This is probably where the major promise of behavioral regulation seems to lie today in European policymaking. There are signs that things are happening are changing a little bit. So you might have heard that the new European Commission decided to withdraw several proposals among which the circular economy, which would have increased the recycling targets across the member states. And there was a quite powerful cost-benefit analysis suggesting that the benefits stemming from this policy would have been much more significant than the cost, but still, for political reasons, the new Commission decided to withdraw those cost-benefit analyses. Well, it's one of the first time ever in which cost-benefit analysis has been invoked by NGOs in order to ask the regulator to act in such a way. This is an interesting change, although the political calculus and the emotions continue to drive policymaking because this proposal has been withdrawn. Evidence has been collected, and now it is used by civil society, which is somehow organizing itself around the use of evidence in policymaking. Well, this is quite new. And this is the context in which the EU is looking at behavioral-informed intervention today. So if it is so appealing, what are the obstacles that could emerge vis-à-vis the European nudging state? Well, first of all, there's an issue of practicability. As it was mentioned this morning, the European administration is composite. And as a result, in contrast to many other jurisdictions, has virtually no direct contact with its own citizens, something that is unfortunate, which is somehow politically controversial. But this is true for several reasons. First of all, most of the competences requiring states to interact with its citizens, I'm thinking about taxation, I'm thinking about welfare, about defense, about education, have not been transferred to the European level. And even when competences have been transferred to the European level, in the absence of specific delegation of enforcement powers, the implementation occurs pretty much at the member state level, according very often to solutions that have been identified by those member states under the classic instrument of a directive, a European directive. And third, as a result of the decentralized nature of the EU as an administration, also the provision of administrative services to citizens is generally provided and designed at the local level. But there's an even more methodological obstacle, which is not structural to European nudging. Little is known about the sensitivity of the human cognitive and emotional foibles to cultural differences. So the issue seems particularly important at the European level, where we have the same legislation which is applicable for Portugal to Finland. And more studies seems to be needed to distinguish universal from cultural sensitive biases before experimenting and taking into account those insights. There's another important element that renders nudging difficult to implement, and this is the high level of variation in nudge type awareness. Countries can be distinguished in different segments. We have the pre-nudge countries, they never heard about this. Policy circles have not really become aware of this. Then we have the incipient nudge states, like perhaps Germany and France. And then you have the mature nudge states, those states who have been experimenting, thinking about the United Kingdom, of course, but partly also Denmark. So it remains to be seen what influence this set of institutional efforts, which are developing in a fragmented fashion at the European Union level, will then translate and change and shape the European administrative culture. So the Commission is running now these days, these months, sort of mapping exercise, trying to take a picture of nudging type intervention existing at the EU level across the 28 member states. We are trying to understand which is the attitude of policymakers vis-à-vis the possibility of integrating this body of evidence in the development of their own policies. And hopefully, by the end of spring, we're going to be able to come up with a report that will present some initial result. But of course, there is a more significant obstacle, and I'm coming to an end, to the possibility of using nudges or nudge-type intervention in the Union. In contrast with many other jurisdictions, but in particular with the United States, the legitimacy debate at the European level, not necessarily at the member state level, does not necessarily revolve around the paternalistic nature of the intervention. The question today seems more about the source of the intervention. So, who is nudging? And can the European Union, as it is, nudge and use these forms of instruments, which seems to rely more on persuasion than on coercion? Well, nudging, and we have been discussing thoroughly about this, suppose somehow a shared political understanding of what is good in society, or at least what is permissible and what is not. And that's exactly what, in principle, any sovereign state does to decide what is an ideal or worthy citizens through the definition of good and bad habits. Yet, when we apply such an assumption to the European Union, this does seem to hold. The European Union shares its citizenry, its notion of citizenship and legal status of citizenship with that of the member state. And as a result, there are several visions of what a good citizen is or ought to be in the European Union. So this is the context in which we find ourselves in the current integration process. But despite the limited opportunities for the EU to directly affect its citizens, the Union has somehow been trying to shape the lives of the citizens. And it has been doing this basically because it had to create an internal market. So by leveraging on the paired instruments of the internal market and the notion of European citizenship, the Union has allowed a sort of redefinition at the supranational level of what the good is. And this regardless of where we come from. But most of the time he has done so in a very not evidence-less fashion. And if we look at the first nudges that we're presenting this morning, we can see a common thread among them. Most of them, they belong to what with our co-author we like to call counter-nudging, so forms of regulation of private nudging by the market. So these efforts at offsetting the negative consequences stemming from exploitative uses of behavioral insights. So if I can come to a final conclusion, several constitutional and political traits of the European Union seem to suggest that its policymaking could not only accommodate, but could also benefit from the integration of these new bodies of evidence. The European Union policymaking seems to be very much driven to goals. It's a goal-driven process. What the Court of Justice called l'effet utile is a very goal-driven approach. And also the fact that European policymaking is started by a technocratic body like the European Commission rather than an assembly like a parliament seems to somehow be conducive to more evidence-based experimentation, which might include also nudge-type intervention. And third, last point, the tension existing between the competence of the EU and those of the member states, which is typical of any federal system, might perhaps find some comfort in the integration of a body of knowledge which is capable of injecting a fresh empirical guidance on how to draw and who is better placed to regulate the member states of the European Union. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask you about a general trend on member state level, whether you can see one towards the inclusion of nudging as a regulatory tool, but I think we have to wait for that till April, till your study comes out. So the second statement will be delivered by Gertrude Lübbe-Wolff. She's probably well known to all of you in the room. I will, however, present her very briefly. She's a professor of public law at the University of Bielefeld, and from 1994 to 2012, she was a justice of the German Federal Constitutional Court. She, excuse me? 14. Did I say 12? Sorry. It's like eat. Sorry. She received numerous prizes and awards, amongst which are the Leibniz Prize of the German Research Foundation and the Hegel Prize of the city of Stuttgart. She has widely published on almost all areas of law, but with a particular emphasis on environmental law. And in his laudatio of Professor Lübbe-Wolff on the occasion of the award of the Hegel Prize, Dieter Grimm especially applauded her remarkable abilities to bridge between philosophy and jurisprudence, as well as between legal studies and legal practice. Today she's going to examine the constitutional admissibility of nudges, and we are curious about your judgment.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm afraid I won't be able to give any proof of the abilities mentioned by Dieter on that former occasion. Just a few remarks on the on constitutional law aspects of health-related nudging. Politically, as well as from the point of constitutional law, I don't see good reasons to generally object to health-related nudging. Nor do I, on the other hand, see any good reasons to issue a general sort of constitutional clearance certificate on the grounds that nudging always leaves the addressee at liberty. I think for the sake of brevity, I won't elaborate on the first part of that assertion. I've made a few remarks on that in my written statement, and I'll skip that now and turn to the second half. Well, if the state or government is not generally barred from nudging people into more health-conscious behavior or from imposing duties to nudge on others, the constitutional admissibility of nudging in specific cases will be a matter of balancing, and in that respect I think it is insufficient to point to the fact that people who are just being nudged are left at liberty to resist the nudge. Nudges or regulations concerning duties to nudge others can interfere with constitutional rights in a variety of ways, and I will just mention some obvious examples. First example, even a mere governmental information campaign aiming to make people more aware of the advantages of regular exercise or healthier food or abstention from smoking and so on can be conducted in a way, could be conducted in a way that would violate the dignity or personality rights of, say, obese people. I think people with heavy overweight do not have a right to demand that government treat widespread obesity as a state of affairs which is just as desirable as any other state of affairs. Or to demand that smoking be welcomed by government or just as welcome as any other sort of behavior. But they have a right not to be shamed by the way the government advocates prevention. Second example, in the case of the prescribed warnings on tobacco products, smokers, which do not really work, I'm so sorry. Smokers remain free to smoke, but companies don't remain free to sell their products in packages designed according to their own choice. So cases of that type raise not only the question of whether a nudge violates a constitutional right of the person which is nudged, but also the question whether an obligation imposed on someone to nudge others violates a constitutional right. And I think the right answer will according to proportionality and equality criteria, depend on various aspects, such as the seriousness of the burden placed on the addressee of the obligation, the weight of the interest or value to be promoted, and the extent to which the nudge will promote it, the existence of good reasons to pick just the addressee as the addressee of the obligation, and so on. Third example, particular attention, I think, ought to be directed at the constitutional law aspects of nudging by default options. That is, by selecting standard configurations that will apply unless you have opted otherwise. I guess that default options will turn out to be a favorite instrument of choice architects, because no design genius whatsoever is necessary to invent all kinds of applications of that instrument in all kinds of fields. So, from the point of constitutional law, however, statutorily or somehow imperative default options are not necessarily innocent. Of the nudging examples given in Thaler and Sunstein's book, the most illustrative one in this respect, I find, is the idea of giving motorcyclists a choice with respect to wearing a helmet. The default option will be that motorcyclists have to wear a helmet, but that's the design. They can get rid of that obligation by getting special biking training, or in some other design, in alternative designs, by showing that they have insurance, or in yet another alternative design, which you have chosen to put in a footnote for some reason, which which I understand, is the idea that you can get rid of the obligation to wear a helmet by marking your bike as belonging to an organ donor. That is, by consenting to donate your organs in case of an accident with your bike without a helmet. I have my doubts as to whether you are consistent when you qualify this as a mere nudge. According to your definition, nudges do not forbid any options. Now, in this framework, in this helmet framework, bikers can opt either to wear a helmet or to donate their organs, but they cannot opt neither to wear a helmet nor to donate their organs. So you exclude a single option, but you do not. You don't exclude a single option, but you do exclude a certain combination of options, and usually combinations of options are just as much covered by constitutional liberties as single options. If there's a definition problem here, but this could be easily amended in some way, but whatever the definition of a nudge and whichever way it's applied here, the installation of such a framework will interfere with constitutional rights guaranteed under the German basic law, at least. If this is easily overlooked, it is due to the alternativity, one must say, of the interference. The biker can choose between alternative restrictions of his constitutional liberty to act as he wishes. That's a constitutional liberty that we have here. Dieter doesn't like the idea, but it has been in the basic law has been interpreted in this way. So there's an alternative interference with this constitutional liberty to act as you wish, and that makes the whole thing a constitutionally relevant interference, which needs to be justified according to usual criteria, that is, which needs a statutory basis and needs to be justified as being proportional. And that's all in this case. Now, how the principle of proportionality is applied to this type of alternative interferences may as yet need some clarification. At first guess, I think burdensome alternatives would seem acceptable if the less burdensome alternative plus the burden of opting is acceptable. So that's the test that you would have to apply. But at any rate, it's established doctrine of the German Constitutional Court that interference with the constitutional right is not made constitutionally irrelevant by allowing people to escape it via some alternative option which, if mandatory, would itself interfere with the constitutional right. Now, even if we look at default options burdening individuals with no more than a duty to opt out, or a necessity, a burden to opt out, not a duty, to opt out of the standard configuration, there may be a constitutionally relevant burden too. Look at the examples given in your book. People might be nudged into more retirement savings by programs providing that you make certain regular payments, certain regular savings, unless you have opted out, or you might be nudged into donating organs for transplantation by regulation providing that you are treated as if you had consented, or that you are presumed to have consented, unless you have made a declaration to the contrary. Now, even supposing it were made sure that people are properly informed about their options, preferably before they die, those who dislike the default option will be burdened with the simple necessity to opt out. And placing this burden on them might. That's, I think, we aren't finished with the question, but that might in itself be an interference with their right to act or omit as they choose, depending on form and frequency of the required act of opting, and also probably depending on the extent to which the default option can be presumed to be what most people want. Such a burden may also turn out to be excessive. Just imagine a statute according to which you bequeath all your fortune to the Republic unless you have made a declaration to the contrary before a notary public no more, and confirm this if it's longer time ago, no longer than 12 months before your death. That would seem a perfect default option, and yet I don't think this would find mercy before the Federal Constitutional Court. And I think we should analyze the reasons why in more detail, but I think it's quite obvious that that wouldn't pass a test of constitutionality. Now, considering that the frequency of the necessity to opt is one of the factors determining the weight of burdens of opting out, the acceptability of mandatory default options might also depend on how many of them there are. In other words, if default options will turn out a favorite nudging instrument, as I guess they will, we might get a problem of incrementally summed up burdens of opting out. This is hard to control by courts, by constitutional courts too, whose immediate object of scrutiny is always the incremental unit and not the summed up effects. Nevertheless, and politically speaking all the more, these incrementally summed up effects should be taken in account from the outset when considering, on what occasions to resort to a single and certain and specific nudging default option solution. Imagine my horror vision is a smart home which keeps us busy all the time, reopening shutters that have gone down automatically, calling off orders which our fridge has sent to the supermarket, and turning on lights which have switched off, presuming that nobody was in the room while I was just there sitting quietly reading nudges and wanting nothing else. I had to get up and wave my hands to let the light know that it should be on again. This is a horror vision. I had a beginning of that in one of my office in recent years, so I know what I'm speaking about. So I think we certainly wouldn't want a smart republic keeping us busy opting out of all kinds of default options all the time. We should consider this at the outset and not only when we are at the point where it becomes really annoying. So to sum up, I'm very sympathetic to Cass Sunstein's appeal that we do not approach the nudging problem with big theory right at the outset, but that we look at specific examples, and then maybe we can proceed to some generalizations. But I think I would even urge you, or to maybe generalize a little less when advocating the harmlessness of judges, of nudges. Yeah.
Thank you. Very good. No. Oh, God. Okay, from the harmlessness of judges to nudges, to our first statement that is given by Martin Eifert. He's a professor of public law and especially administrative law at Humboldt University in Berlin. And the focus of his research lies on administrative law, namely on the question of regulation and analysis of regulatory instruments. And in doing so, he has especially addressed the problem of how to align regulation and innovation, for example, in the digital world. And today he's going to frame or reframe the nudging question as a political question and a political matter. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ann-Katrin. The discussion of nudging is usually, well, not at this conference, but usually, a discussion about autonomy versus paternalism. This is suggested by the fact that nudging addresses the individual and aims at influencing their behavior in fields in which we cannot expect rational self-determination. The strong focus on the individual and the orientation of the discussion within this matrix of autonomy versus paternalism is very interesting against the background of self-conception. However, it's misguided as a basis for a discussion about nudging as a regulatory approach. In almost all relevant cases in which nudging is discussed, we do not merely protect citizens from themselves. We regard individual behavior which does not harm third parties directly, but nevertheless has significant social impact. The modern welfare state transforms individual risks into social problems. Poverty triggers a right to social benefits, illness entitles to medical care, and both are financed by taxpayers or other members of society. The welfare state has linked individual risky behavior to matters of social infrastructure and social justice. Probably the state of the welfare state and its design is the most important issue if we are talking about environmental environments and the discussion of nudging and how it is framed. We find this link wherever nudging is discussed, at least that's my assumption. I must admit, as for me, it was very surprising when Cass Sunstein told us that the regulation on fuel savings could not be justified on grounds of externalities. I expected it to be justified against the background of climate change, and I think we probably in Europe would frame it that way, and we would justify it on these grounds. Anyway, nudging, to my mind, has not been developed to prevent people from irresponsible borrowing, for instance, because we care about individual waste of money. Rather, the objective is preventing of extensive debts which lead to insolvency, which in turn triggers social responses at helping the individual. And of course, we would like to stabilize our financial sector. Thus, nudging is not just about protecting citizens from themselves, it's moreover about solutions for social problems. The search for an adequate approach to a social problem, of course, is the standard case for regulation. Parallel to other kinds of regulation, it calls for a political decision on whether or not nudging should be chosen as an instrument to remedy the social costs entailed with this individual behavior. One focus in this political debate should be on the alternative of educating versus nudging. The more we are interested merely in a desirable outcome, and the less we care about the underlying patterns that drive our behavior, the more we might be inclined to use nudging as an effective means. Healthy meals in the cafeteria might be a case in point. We could discuss that later, of course. However, the more we want a behavior to be backed by a specific attitude, the more we might favor education despite its inefficiencies. Wherever we try to influence decisions that are closely linked to important values of self-perception or to societal values, there is more at stake than just the outcome. If you think about organ donation, for instance, we are not just interested in a high number of organ donators, but we would very much like donation to confirm solidarity in society. And we know, of course, that the decision affects personal values. In this case, we should not use opt-out designs, but rather education, or at least we should force people to make well-informed decisions. From a legal point of view, in cases of nudging, it has to be reviewed whether this measure chosen is not disproportionate, and that has already been developed by Gertrude Lübbe-Wolff. The most important point is whether the balance of interest is proportionate. And our point of reference, at least in the discussions, and we know that far, is always whether or not a coercive measure would be justified or not. This, again, depends heavily on the regulatory environment. Probably this is not a helpful point of reference in the US discourse. But that's the way we frame it, and this is the benchmark against which we always decide whether or not the measure might be justified or not. If the relevant situation for nudging are those in which choices have social impact, nudging is a matter of politics, of course, and we have to discuss it in the political arena. For any political deliberation, transparency is crucial. The call for transparency is already made by Taylor and Sunstein, of course. In the book, however, this is linked to the respect for the individual that is nudged. If this is the case, then the transparency has to be given in the specific interaction between government and the citizen. When focusing on the political deliberation, and that's, of course, what you did yesterday in your talk and what we were talking about in the morning, the issue of transparency concerns the legitimate goals, the design of nudging, the instrumental choice, the field of application, specific concepts, mechanisms of evaluation, and so forth. And decisions on all these questions require public accountability. We should rationally discuss whether we would like to be nudged or not. In this regard, nudging can pose problems. It can seep into institutions and subvert constitutional mechanisms that ensure transparent public debate. This is mainly because the loss of individual freedom of the person is nudged is comparatively scant. And the nudge does not necessarily trigger any resistance of the person being nudged. And as for this point, the term might be misleading because, I mean, if you're nudged, literally nudged, you feel it, especially if you're nudged by an elephant. If we have successful nudging, at least in the case of default options, you do not feel anything because you automatically reply to the nudge. In any case, as the loss of the individual freedom is usually minor, we require no action by the legislator, and consequently, there's no public debate. However, this problem pertains merely to interaction between citizen and state, because in a lot of the regulatory frameworks, as we have seen, we impose a duty on a private party, and in this case, of course, this duty needs to be justified, and we need a legislative basis for doing so. And even regarding the relationship between citizen and state, we can well argue that a systematic employment of nudging by public authorities can give rise to a new, distinct quality of the approach, and that this should require a different legal answer. As we well know, the phenomenon of privatization entails similar problems. We can ask for a statutory basis, for instance, if we cooperate with private parties in administrative procedures, if the administration does so on a systematic basis, even if we do not require this, if it is done in an individual case. Overall, nudging receives so much attention because it incorporates fresh knowledge generated by the emerging field of behavioral economics. The nudging discourse aims at using it for policymaking in a new form. Questions of individual bias and overconfidence, for instance, had already been discussed in the discourse on risk regulation in the 1990s. But in this discourse, they had been spread with the goal of informational educational. Pointing out misleading risk perceptions was supposed to result in acceptance of rational risk management. Nowadays, such problems are perceived as facets of fundamental problems of individual self-determination. The nudging discourse emphasizes the inevitability of such deficits, and it makes these deficits available for rational policymaking. As a result, the toolbox of rational policymaking will be stocked more extensively. This has happened before, of course. Welfare economics led to fees and certificates as elements of environmental policy. Institutional economics provided information on sound governance structures. And with respect to this genealogy, however, we should not be surprised if initial euphoria will be followed by disillusionment. Economic knowledge does not lead us towards unambiguous conclusions. And so we may once again have to realize that rational policymaking is but an ideal of modern societies. In a nutshell, nudging is nice, but maybe not different. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there already any questions you would like to ask? If not, I would... Well, you go ahead if you want to. Christoph?
Okay.
No? Okay. If you...
I have a question to Alberto, which is in a way a very general and perhaps massive question I'm a little bit ashamed of, but I want to ask it anyhow. I think your storyline about Europe and the United States was a little bit a story about experimental, empirically informed legislation on the one hand and ideology, politicized legislation on the other hand. That's what you actually explicitly said. And you said, okay, now we have to infuse, knowledge, empirical knowledge into European legislation. I have in a way two questions to if this storyline really works out. The first one is, there is an old pragmatist, the first one is rather theoretical, normative, the second one is more empirical. The normative theoretical is, there is an old, even American pragmatist Deweyan story about the cognitive achievements of democratic procedures, input procedures, elections. Parties may bundle preferences and so on and so forth. That's a very general and in a way very crude story. But it is there that I think, even if we think much more soberly about the political process today than perhaps Dewey did, it is still an argument for wondering about the substitution of these processes by processes that cannot be but technocratic in a certain way. And at least there must be something like a comparison. And I think the bottom line of the pragmatist argument would be there is no real pure fact-value distinction, and therefore it would be strange to define a democratic process as something purely ideological. It would be strange to define regulatory experimentation as something purely empirical. Both probably won't work out as a matter of theory. And as a matter of empirical question, I was just wondering, when we have so much ratings and meta-empirical research about comparative regulation, would we think after a lot of decades of empirically, and not only by nudging, but by many, and Martin mentioned some of the movements, by so much empirically informed regulation in, let's say, the United States and the United Kingdom, that the performance of this legislation is actually higher than the performance of states within the OECD, for example, that does not apply these kind of methods.
Yes, wonderful. Wow. I have a lot to think about here before providing a complete answer. But first of all, Christoph, I think that I might have presented my case or my storyline in a bit caricatural way. I didn't necessarily wanted to oppose as a black and white the two policy-making experiences. I was trying to show how the European Union policy-making has been certainly be driven by a very neo-functionalist objective, the ideal to follow the market and therefore to follow what it was written in the treaties. And in doing so, there has been some ideology. So we've been somehow pushing for those objectives in the court that follow with what I mentioned, the FAUT. So always trying to overstretch even the competence given by the union in order to provide a given result regardless of the effect. So there hasn't been much, let's say, both at the level of policymaking and adjudication regard towards the evidence. Now, I think, as I try to depict with a few examples, I think the situation is somehow changing. The EU is on one side becoming more and more technocratic because of the way in which it has been conceived, but at the same time it contains and it relies on a sort of dual legitimacy that is drawn both from representative democracy and participatory democracy, which is something quite unique. So it's trying on the one side to gather the best possible evidence and to create a deliberate process that is certainly based on the best available evidence, but at the same time is creating many more channels of communication with the different polities in Europe, or one polity, much more than at the national level. So the EU is experimenting much more than at the national state, but it doesn't have any clients, meaning that there's no European polity who is capable of engaging into such an exercise. And it is against this backdrop that it might be interesting to see how the behavioral informed regulation might somehow trigger more attention by that polity, which is in theory, because it's emerging into this process.
Okay, I have already a couple of questions. I think, Hannah, you wanted to add something from the internet first, so from the Internet Explorer.
It's actually Safari.
Oh, Safari. Wow.
No, this is another comment by Anne van Aken from St. Gallen, who is following us on the live feed. And she actually posted this comment during the lunch break in response to a statement by Professor Cassese. But I do believe it actually is very pertinent here as we are talking about whether or not and which types of nudges might necessitate constitutional justifications. So Anne van Aken says that Sabino Cassese is right. There is no doubt that a nudge is an interference, both under German doctrine or under the European Convention on Human Rights or the European Charter on Fundamental Rights, because it is intended to interfere with choice. But she argues justification is different if the nudge's aim is paternalistic. This is the distinction she made last night already in a comment between paternalistic nudges, which are for the individual's welfare, and non-paternalistic nudges introduced for society's welfare. And she argues that the justification would be different if nudges are paternalistic or in the interest of public welfare. But she also raises awareness to, she says, beware of cheating with aims. And I believe that ties into the statement that Professor Eifert just made, that individual risks have evolved into becoming more of a social policy, social infrastructure question. So maybe that's a point that could be interesting for the discussion. She concludes by saying, well, the answer to the wonderful question of Sabino Cassese during the second panel this morning must be that the control of state nudging must be even more scrutinized, because the state is a monopoly? And if I may, I would follow up with a question of my own, this time not from the internet, because I've been wondering, if we agree with this general statement that yes, nudges that come from the state must be scrutinized, I'm wondering whether the justification can be done with the tools that we normally have for constitutional justification of interferences in at least the German doctrine in the way of Eingriff. Is for instance proportionality enough, or do we maybe need a different type of scrutinization of justification because the type of interference is different than the interference that we normally deal with in constitutional review situations? So that's an open question to the panel, also maybe Professor Sunstein. Thank you.
Well, yes. Is it new, or do we need new scale to weigh the burden of a nudge? Maybe one of you wants to, Professor Lübbe-Wolff, you addressed that already in your statement. Maybe you want to respond to Hannah's question? I don't know. Whether we can use the doctrine that we already established to weigh the burden and the seriousness of a nudge, or do we need a new set of instruments to get at grips with what is happening with the interference of individual liberties that comes along with nudges?
I think, of course, we can use the traditional instruments, and the application to the specific cases may need attention for aspects which other cases don't show, like dangers of manipulation, subconscious steering, and so on. But I don't think we needed a generally different framework. And I mean, we have jurisprudence on all of this, and it has never been considered a big problem to, like, for instance, mandatory warnings on tobacco products. It has never been considered a particularly difficult type of case, which needs quite a different approach.
Oh. Next one on my list is Professor Klün.
Thank you. A very short question for Alberto. Alberto, do you think that there are typical features within the political economy of the EU which makes nudging less likely, especially if we open the black box and look inside what's in the black box, especially the individual incentives? Let's think about career tracks of EU officials, how EU judges are picked. Do you see any distinct features there which might explain why we see less nudging on the EU level? Yeah.
Well, this is a very difficult question. The most obvious answer is that awareness about behavioral sciences probably emerged only recently, so we didn't have much experimentation going on. However, several countries seem to be keen on at least trying. The European Union itself now has to be sort of wary and cautious in not following any institutional or methodological model that is developed by one particular country, because it would immediately Europeanize that particular model. So that's explained why the European Union is not necessarily speaking with one voice, as you might have noticed, over the issue, and each department and directorate has a different sensitivity. So the story I've heard from DG Competition is the story of a public administration called the European Commission that enjoys the monopoly of the application of competition law. This is one story. The other story you might have heard in other policy areas are policy areas where the European Union is proposing legislation, but this legislation is implemented at the member state level. So you see how diverse the European Union play with its different prerogatives when taking into account what it could learn, how it could use behavioral research.
Hans-Michael Heinrich?
Martin Eifert gave us the nudge to skip the morning session and stay longer in bed or go to office when he said it's not useful to talk about nudging in the context of autonomy versus paternalism. And this is the topic of the morning panel tomorrow. And I think in some way he's right. So I have to come tomorrow morning because I can give a short presentation, but maybe I should give you some advertising to join me.
I'll be there.
No, you were totally right, I think, when you said nudgings are a solution for social problems. And I agree when you say the welfare state changes the frame of nudging. But there might be one reason to look into the paternalism discourse, and that's that we learn a lot or something about concepts of autonomy when we think about the paradoxes in the paternalism discourse. And this is the reason we learn something about autonomy, concept of freedom, and the political concepts of self-government in the context of the paternalism discourse. That's the reason why we shouldn't skip it at all.
I totally agree with you. It's very interesting to reflect on these issues. And we can imagine a lot of nudges that pose very difficult problems that have to do with autonomy. My point is that we do not find them in practice. The way nudging is conceptualized is as a regulatory means. And therefore, we typically address social problems. That we can imagine all the other problems and that we can think of hard cases in which all these tensions have to be resolved. I totally agree with you. So I think tomorrow we will start hard thinking. Today is just about practice.
Okay, we'll keep on practicing with Professor Gessner, please.
Alberto, you told us that in the European Union there is now more need for evidence-based policy in relating to nudges. Now in economics we have in recent years a whole discussion about empirically based economic policy. The US, for example, we had a workshop, it's published in the Journal of Economic Perspective, 2010. In the UK, in Germany, we had the last meeting of the European Economic Association on this topic. But I've never heard the term nudges in these relations. Is there any relation between these two discourses, or are they totally separated?
I think that's a wonderful point. Is a nudge that you're giving me, probably a bit more than this, in having a look at whether this discourse has penetrated the legal empirical movement in general. I haven't seen it, but I think that what I've been trying to convey today as a message is that behavioral sciences and behavioral research might actually provide impetus for the European Union to embrace also experimentalism in that sense. So I think that the two words might want to talk one to another, and I think there might be space for this. In theory, in a federal organization, which we are not in the European Union, in the logic of federalism, there should be experimentalism. I think we all agree. In the European Union, I think the overall level of experimentalism, federal experimentalism, has been extremely limited. So we have only few instances in which the union has been somehow promoted and pushing for this kind of experimentalism in addressing, diversity. We have tried the famous principle of mutual recognition that basically says that it's possible to reconcile regulatory divergence with harmony, meaning going towards the same direction and creating an internal market, could have and should have provided such an answer, but it didn't. Most of the policy areas today are being somehow harmonized, and therefore there has not been so much space for diversity from a regulatory perspective in the EU.
Are there any more questions that you, Professor Volkmann?
I'm afraid the audience is rather exhausted than convinced.
Well, I ask my last question nevertheless, and it's to Gertrude Lübbe-Wolff. You doubted the constitutionality of some of measures of nudging, and I don't see it that problematic. And just let me come back to a few examples you talked of. The first example is the problem of default rules. In the helmet case, you criticized Cass Sunstein for offering only two options in that case, that is wearing a helmet or becoming an organ donor. But what are we doing? We don't offer any options at all. We just force people to wear a helmet, and we don't see a problem in it nowadays. And the second example is the problem of organ donations itself, and the discussion whether we organize it according to a consent rule or to an objection rule. I doubt whether this is really a problem, because at first there's a crucial difference to your other example, the establishing of a default rule forcing you to set up a last will if you want to avoid that all your property goes to the state. But there are the rights of a third party affected, that is the potential heirs, your children or grandchildren, which have a constitutional right. And I don't see whose constitutional right really is affected in the case of an objection rule, and how seriously is it affected. And why shouldn't we leave this just open to the political process, to political deliberation and public debate? Because formulation of constitutional restraints in the very end means nothing else than that we take away all these matters away from public debate and lay it into the hand of constitutional courts, that is, judges, in the hand of judges. And I don't consider them as harmless as you in that respect.
Okay.
Would you like to respond?
Can I? Yeah. Well, I was not really raising problems of constitutionality in the sense that I doubt that certain nudges would be, or all types of nudges are really a problem. I'm just saying it is not a type of regulation that is constitutionally irrelevant from the outset just because it leaves people at liberty to opt this way or another way. The specific case of bequeathing your fortune to the state, I mean, my problems would be no less if the portion which is mandatory for the usual heirs like children and spouses and so on would be preserved, and only the part that you cannot withdraw from them according to German law, and which is maybe this part might be protected by the constitution in itself, if that part weren't affected, but only that part which any person can dispose of freely under German constitutional law, if only that part would be affected. I would still doubt the constitutionality of that particular rule, but I'm not saying that I'm opposing that I'm in that most nudges that I have constitutional problems with most nudges. I think it's just they have to go through the usual process of balancing and justification, and most of what is mentioned in that book, I think, would probably be well past the constitutional balancing test with no problem. Can I ask one question, because
Absolutely.
Gebhard Kirchgessner did not raise it, so I will I will raise it and play sort of the devil's advocate and ask Martin Eifert. You spoke about the the social impact of, say, overeating and alcohol consumption and all that is not just self-damaging behavior but has social implications. So we discussed this earlier with Gebhard Kirchgessner, and he said, well, from the point of view of social interests of the community in not spending so much money with diseases having relating to unhealthy types of behavior, he said, well, it is from the point of view of public spending, it is much better having people eat and drink themselves to death at an early age rather than live up to the stage where you will be facing dementia and then create much bigger costs. So I personally, I have an idea how to deal with this argument, but how would you deal with it?
Well, for some reason we don't like to make this calculation at all. I think that if this is the case, I don't know the figures, but it sounds quite reasonable. If this is the case, of course, it's not a question of utilitarian approach, but it's probably handled in a way that we say it has social implications, and we justify it not by the numbers, not by the figures, but just by not accepting that they use the benefits without taking the responsibility. And therefore, it's sort of a mixed claim of normative assumptions and empirical data. If we just look at the empirical data, we might say in many of these cases that it does not have any negative effects on the social infrastructure or question of social justice. Nevertheless, I think we conceive it, our notion is that solidarity doesn't work if we allow people, even if the figures allows them to do so, to behave in a way that they simply rely on the help of others without taking their own responsibilities. And that's a normative facet that has to do with the welfare state, even though it has nothing to do with cost-benefit balancing. So I think that's along this line I would try to answer the question. I don't know whether you had the same in mind, because you said you have an idea about how to deal with it.
Maybe you would like
Maybe you disclose
to
it.
reply directly?
You can disclose it selectively?
Well, that's one of the points, and another is that it is sort of it's a long-term calculus that you are making up, and we might have a discount rate taking into account that in 50 years we might have medication against dementia or something, so that even if public spending alone is taken into consideration, we still don't know, and the legislator must be at liberty to assess what is the better solution in terms of not overstraining the society's ability to deliver health services.
Just one remark, you nevertheless have to pay the pensions.
Could you just take the microphone? Just for the people on the internet?
Nevertheless have to pay the pensions, and if people die early, you save a lot of money.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, if I may add one point on this issue. Since 2011, the United Nations recognizes the non-communicable diseases that are those stemming from behavior, which are behavior linked to tobacco consumption, harmful use of alcohol, or an healthy diet, as mainly responsible for the vast majority of preventable death. And the international community has not built an economic case for intervention. So if you look and you read through the lines the documents which have been produced and which are encouraging all the member states and the international community to take action vis-à-vis NCD, the real rationale for action would seem rather to lie into social justice reasons. So how the current burden of the disease is allocated across society. And this would seem to be a much stronger case for intervention than the one that might rely on an economic argument. This is the answer that was given to the argument you raised and was developed by, I think, Professor Kip Viscusi a few years ago during the time in which the tobacco litigation were happening in the United States.
I think there was a remark or a question back there.
Thank you. My name is Robert Zbiral. I would like to return to the European Union and to Professor Alemanno, and also relates to what Professor Meller said at the beginning. I think it was rightly said that the European Commission is obsessed with this better regulation program, which was actually renamed to smart regulation, and nowadays it's regulatory fitness. So, but nevertheless, like, what's the name, although the content is more or less the same. You said that you would welcome more evidence-based research, you would welcome more cost-benefit analysis, and I think the Commission is clearly going to that direction with Vice President Tindemans' plans, and I heard today that the Commission is about to set up this behavioral science unit. Yet the flagship part of better regulation are regulatory impact assessments, and empirically from what I know, they are not used at all, even by the legislators in the process afterwards. I read somewhere that out of the 15,000 documents in the European Parliament between 2009 and 2014, it was cited only twice. And in the Council, it was the same, that they have to set up a pilot project in a working group, like to discuss this regulatory impact assessments, and it was abandoned afterwards anyway. So my question is clear, like, if you think there would be a real benefit in that, and maybe if we go deeper, if it's not this image of technocratic and bureaucratic commission that is actually making the people feel distance from the EU. And maybe we should not like replace this cost-benefit and evidence-based research with more ideology that the people could simply understand more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think your question goes to the heart of what the new administration is currently facing as a dilemma. So the European Commission, in the system as we know it, is the only institution that can propose legislation. And it does a pretty good work in collecting the evidence and listening to the different stakeholders when preparing a proposal. But as soon as the proposal is sent and shared with the co-legislators, meaning the Parliament and the Council, it loses control of the proposals. And it has been difficult historically for the Commission to keep in control of that. And that's exactly the issue that has been spotted by the new Commission and notably by Commissioner Timmermans. We don't know which is the solution that they're going to try to come up with in order to address such an issue, but it seems that the idea, according to some articles that appear in newspaper, would be to create an autonomous entity, an entity that would basically institutionalize what we call the trialogue. The trialogue is the informal process of legislative making in Europe, where we have the Commission representative, the desk officer who has been drafting the proposal, the members of the European Parliament coming from the different parties, just a few, and the Council representative, and deciding. So the idea would be to create a committee that is somehow representing the three institutions and that will accompany the proposal in order to guarantee the sustainability of the amendments and the new ideas that are coming up and they're added to the proposal, and at the same time they're going to be receptive to the stakeholder ideas on the proposal. So this is one of the possible solutions, is one of the ideas that has been somehow discussed in the media, but possibly in a few weeks we're going to be learning more about this.
Well, this might be a perfect cliffhanger to stop the discussion, and I'd like to give the panelists the possibility for a concluding statement, if you like. If no one wishes to give one, then I thank you very much. Thank you for your participation, and enjoy tonight's dinner, and see you tomorrow.